Look at this one. Probably some think tank intern waiting for her congressman to finish his steak. Ma'am, this table is reserved for people who actually serve, not serve drinks. Time to move. The crowd of young men in crisp civilian clothes, all with the same hard-edged, athletic-bearing laughed. The laughter was sharp and dismissive, echoing off the dark wood and polished brass of the exclusive club near the Coronado shore, a place that prided itself on being a sanctuary for the warrior class. The woman at the table did not look up from her tablet. Her focus remained on the lines of text, her posthumous study in serene stillness. She wore a simple charcoal silk blouse and dark-tailored slacks, an outfit of understated elegance that seemed to make her blend into the shadows of the booth. Her hair, a mix of silver and dark brown, was tied back in a neat, functional bun. There was nothing about her that screamed authority, nothing that demanded attention. She was the picture of quiet anonymity, a ghost in a room full of roaring lions. But when a towering Navy SEAL, a petty officer first class named Marcus Viper Sullivan, placed his thick, calloused hand on her shoulder to physically guide her away, there was a subtle shift in the air. It was a change so imperceptible that only someone trained to notice such things would catch it. The general, sitting in a darkened corner with the base commander, saw it. He saw the way her shoulders, though relaxed, didn't yield a single millimeter to the pressure. He saw the way her eyes, when she finally lifted them from the screen, were not angry or scared or indignant. They were calm. They were analytical. They were the eyes of a predator assessing a threat, not with fear, but with a profound and unsettling patience. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type silence below. The silence that followed her gaze was more powerful than any shouted retort could ever be. It stretched thin and taut, a wire of tension in the boisterous room. Viper, accustomed to immediate deference or fiery confrontation, was momentarily thrown off balance by this utter lack of reaction. His hand remained on her shoulder, an anchor of arrogance in a sea of sudden uncertainty. He mistook her calm for weakness, her silence for submission. It was a common mistake, one made by men who measured strength in decibels and dominance in physical presence. "Hello, did you hear me?" He pressed, his voice louder now, drawing more attention. "This is our spot. We just got back from a rotation. I think we've earned a right to a decent view of the bay. Don't you boys?" His teammates chorused their agreement, their confidence bolstered by his. They were a pack, young and strong. And this woman was an intruder, an outsider who didn't understand the rules of their world. She finally spoke, her voice so low it was almost a whisper, yet it cut through the noise with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm quite comfortable where I am. Petty officer." She didn't look at his hand, but he felt the weight of her words on it, and he instinctively, if briefly, loosened his grip. The use of his rank spoken with such casual, unbothered authority was a minor anomaly, a flicker on a radar screen that he chose to ignore. He saw a middle-aged woman alone in a place she clearly didn't belong. His assumptions were a fortress, and he was not about to surrender it. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, I don't want to have to call management. This is a private club for military. You clearly took a wrong turn somewhere between the yacht club and the spa. So why don't you be a good girl and find a stool at the bar? I'll even buy you an Appleteen for your trouble." The insult was deliberate, a final public humiliation designed to force her from the seat. The laughter from his friends was louder this time, more cruel. The entire west side of the club was now watching the drama unfold. Junior officers averted their eyes, not wanting to get involved. A few enlisted sailors looked uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. Viper and his team were SEALs, the modern-day deities of a naval base, and their arrogance was often mistaken for divine right. The woman simply blinked. She didn't recoil. She didn't blush with shame. She picked up her water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the coaster with a soft, definitive click. Her every movement was economical, devoid of wasted energy. It was a discipline of motion that was utterly at odds with the civilian persona he had assigned to her. Silence was a mirror, and in it his own boorish behavior was reflected back at him, magnified and ugly. He was beginning to feel a prickle of irritation, the kind that comes when a simple act of dominance meets an inexplicable, immovable object. He was about to escalate, to raise his voice and make a scene that would be impossible to ignore when the world outside the plate glass window, the serene stardust view of the San Diego Bay, erupted in a silent, violent flash of red and blue light. The world was about to change, and with it, every single one of Marcus Sullivan's foolish assumptions. The true test was not of strength, but of composure. And the woman he was trying to bully was about to give a master class. The sudden chaos was immediate and absolute. The club's ambient music cut out, replaced by the shrill, piercing tone of a base-wide security alert blaring from speakers mounted on the walls. Red emergency lights began to strobe, bathing the panicked faces of the patrons in a hellish, pulsating glow. The club's private security, two burly men in ill-fitting blazers, moved towards the doors, their expressions a mixture of confusion and fear. Cell phones lit up across the room as people tried to get information, but the signal was dead. A jamming protocol. That simple fact sent a wave of genuine dread through the military personnel in the room. This wasn't a drill. This was real. The senior officer on site, a young Navy lieutenant named James Chun, fresh from a desk job at NavBay's Coronado headquarters, began shouting into his radio, his voice cracking with inexperience. "This is Oasis Club. We are in lockdown. What is the nature of the threat over?" The response was a burst of static followed by fragmented panic chatter from different channels. "Motorcade compromised. VIP is off-grid. Possible hostile element." I repeat, the information was disjointed, a recipe for disaster. Viper and his SEALed team, their earlier arrogance forgotten, immediately shifted into operator mode. They began moving through the crowd, their voices sharp and commanding, trying to establish control. "Everyone away from the windows. Get down. Hands where I can see them." They were warriors trained for direct action, for violence and speed. But this situation wasn't about kicking down a door. It was about command and control, about processing information and making decisions under immense pressure. They were creating more noise, more confusion. Their tactical instincts at odds with the strategic necessity of the moment. Amidst this rising tide of panic, the woman in the charcoal silk blouse moved with an almost supernatural calm. She had placed her tablet carefully back in her leather satchel and stood up. Her movements were not rushed. They were fluid, efficient, and imbued with a sense of purpose that stood in stark contrast to the frantic energy surrounding her. Eyes, those calm, analytical eyes, were not wide with fear. They were scanning. She was taking in the entire scene, processing it not as a victim, but as a commander on a battlefield. She noted the positions of the security guards, the number of exits, the panic state of Lieutenant Chun, the aggressive but directionless actions of the SEALs. She was assessing her assets and liabilities, formulating a plan with the speed of a supercomputer. Her face was a mask of placid concentration, a small island of order in an ocean of chaos. She was not preparing to fight. She was preparing to lead. She was about to demonstrate a skill far more rare and far more powerful than the brute force personified by the man who had just tried to eject her from her seat. Her competence was a coiled spring held in check by a lifetime of discipline, and it was about to be released with devastating and undeniable force. The room was a tinderbox of fear, and she was the only one holding the water. She walked directly towards the epicenter of the chaos, her path cutting a straight line through the cowering patrons. Lieutenant Chun was now pale, sweat beading on his forehead as he fumbled with his radio, trying to get a clear directive from a command structure that was clearly in disarray itself. Viper and his men were arguing with the club security, trying to assert their authority without any official standing. The entire situation was seconds from collapsing into complete, unmanageable panic. The woman reached the flustered lieutenant and did not tap his shoulder or shout for his attention. She simply stood in his peripheral vision, a pillar of stillness, until he finally noticed her. He glanced at her, his eyes full of dismissal for another hysterical civilian, and was about to waver away when she spoke. Her voice was unchanged, still quiet, yet possessed a resonant frequency of command that vibrated in the very air. "Lieutenant," she said, the single word cutting through his panic like a laser. He stopped shouting into his radio and stared at her. "Initiate Protocol Sierra Whiskey. I am assuming tactical command. Designate me Olympus." The phrase was a thunderclap in the silent space of his mind. Protocol Sierra Whiskey was a continuity of command directive so obscure and high-level that he had only ever read about it in a single briefing during his officer training at Annapolis. It was a protocol that could only be invoked by a flag officer in person during a catastrophic breakdown of the local chain of command. It was a phrase that carried the weight of the entire United States Navy. The lieutenant's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the words he had just heard with the unassuming woman standing before him. But there was something in her eyes, an iron certainty, an absolute authority that short-circuited his doubt. His training, deeply ingrained, took over. His back straightened. His panic vanished, replaced by the reflexive obedience of a junior officer in the presence of a superior. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered, his voice suddenly clear. The woman, now Olympus, turned her attention to the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice projected with a calm, unshakable force. "Petty officer," she said, her eyes finding Viper across the room. He froze mid-argument, stunned by the sound of his own rank being called by this woman. "You and your team secure all points of entry. No one in or out. Use club security to assist. Establish a fatal funnel at the main entrance. I want to report on your status in 90 seconds. Her orders were precise, tactically flawless, and delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. The SEALs men, trained to recognize and respond to competent leadership above all else, reacted instinctively. The confusion vanished from their faces, replaced by the focused intensity of the operator. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, Viper nodded sharply. He and his team moved with a sudden lethal grace, their chaotic energy now channeled into a singular directed purpose. The woman then turned back to the lieutenant. "Get me a secure channel to Nav-Base Command. Now tell them Olympus is on station and requires an immediate sit rep on the Viceroy package. Viceroy, another high-level code named this one for a visiting member of the Joint Chiefs. In a space of 30 seconds, she had taken complete and total control of the crisis. She had diagnosed the problem, identified her assets, and issued a series of perfect interlocking commands that transformed a panic mob into a functioning tactical unit. The immediate aftermath was a deafening quiet. The screaming had stopped. The running had ceased. The only sounds were the disciplined movements of the SEALs and the now steady voice of Lieutenant Shun on the radio. Everyone else in the room was simply staring their mouths agape at the woman in the silk blouse who now stood at the center of the storm, directing it, as if she were born to it. Viper, after positioning his men at the door, looked back at her, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. This was not possible. This was not a congressman's wife. This was not a lost tourist. This was a commander. And as he watched her calmly coordinate the defense of the entire facility, a cold, terrifying thought began to dawn in his mind. He had not just insulted a civilian. He had committed an act of professional suicide of catastrophic proportions. The lockdown held for another 20 minutes, an eternity of tense, disciplined silence orchestrated by the woman known only as Olympus. She had turned a corner of the main bar into a makeshift command post. Using the terrified but now compliant Lieutenant Shun as her communications link, she coordinated with the base's rapid response teams, guided them to establish a secondary perimeter, and received real-time intelligence on the status of the compromised motorcade. Her questions were sharp, her insights profound, her strategic grasp of the evolving situation nothing short of brilliant. She saw angles no one else saw, anticipated problems before they arose. She was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Viper and his team, humbled into silent efficiency, held their positions with unwavering professionalism. He watched her, unable to look away, replaying his earlier actions in his mind with a mounting sense of horror. Every arrogant word, every dismissive gesture now seemed like an act of profound sacrilege. Who is she? The question burned in his mind, a firestorm of confusion and dread. The answer arrived in the form of screeching tires and a heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots on pavement. The main doors, which his team had been guarding, were thrown open. A full Marine Fleet anti-terrorism security team or fast platoon flooded into the club, their M4 rifles at the ready, sweeping every corner with practiced lethal precision. They were followed by a man whose presence immediately commanded the attention of every service member in the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and the twin stars of a Rear Admiral gleaming on the collar of his uniform. This was Rear Admiral Robert Martinez, the commander of Naval Base Coronado, and his face was a mask of grim determination. He strode into the center of the room, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in the controlled quiet, the secure positions of the SEALs, the focused demeanor of Lieutenant Chun. His gaze finally landed on the woman at the bar, who was just now turning to face him. The Admiral's expression of hardened resolve instantly melted away, replaced by something else entirely. A look of profound, almost reverent recognition. He didn't hesitate. He marched directly past the fast team, past the stunned SEALs, and came to a halt 3 feet in front of her. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed the sharpest, most formal salute of his long and decorated career. The gesture was so crisp, so full of respect that it seemed to suck the very air from the room. "Admiral Harrison, ma'am." Martinez's voice boomed with a mixture of relief and deference. "I apologize for the delay in our response. We had a complete communications blackout on our end. Your actions here were textbook. You have the Viceroy." The room went utterly still. The words Admiral Harrison and ma'am hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Viper felt the blood drain from his face. It was as if the ground had fallen away beneath his feet. Admiral, not a captain, not a commander. An admiral. The rank was almost mythical. A pantheon of gods who steered the course of the entire Navy. He had never even been in the same room as a 4-star admiral before, let alone spoken to one, let alone put his hands on one. The woman, Admiral Harrison, simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The situation is secure. Admiral Martinez, the Viceroy is not on site." It was a false alarm, a diversion. The real target was a data transfer at the Naval Communication Station. "I believe you'll find they've already dealt with it." Her assessment was delivered with the same quiet calm, the same lack of ego. She had seen through the entire feint, a complex piece of enemy misdirection that had fooled the entire base command. Rear Admiral Martinez simply nodded, his respect for her deepening with every word she spoke. The legend was true. Rear Admiral Martinez turned his gaze from Admiral Harrison, and it swept across the room, finally landing like a pair of targeting lasers on Petty Officer Marcus Viper Sullivan. The warmth and respect in the Admiral's eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial fury that was terrifying to behold. Martinez was a man known for his calm demeanor, but what Viper saw in his eyes now was the promise of a storm. A hurricane of institutional wrath about to be unleashed directly upon his head. The Rear Admiral took a slow, deliberate step towards him. "You are not in the presence of a civilian. You are not in the presence of a staffer or a spouse. You are in the presence of Admiral Catherine Harrison, Commander, United States Pacific Fleet." He paused, letting the title sink in, letting the full weight of it settle on every person in the room. Then he continued, his voice now a litany of her accomplishments, a verbal recitation of a living legend's service record. The first woman to command a carrier strike group in combat. The architect of Operation Silent Trident, a campaign that will be studied at the War College for the next 100 years. An aviator with over 4,000 carrier landing hours, most of them at night. The woman who signs the deployment orders for every ship, every submarine, and every aircraft in this half of the world. The woman who is at this very moment your ultimate commanding officer and the highest-ranking female officer in the history of the United States Armed Forces. Martinez turned his head back to face Viper, his eyes blazing. "You didn't ask a civilian to move. You put your hands on the Pacific Fleet. You insulted a living legend. And you did it because you made an assumption based on what you saw instead of having the humility to consider what you did not know. You looked at quiet competence and saw only a target for your arrogance. That is a mistake a petty officer cannot afford to make. That is a mistake a Navy SEAL must never make. Am I clear?" The final 2 words were like a physical blow. Viper could only stammer a single choked response. The only words left to him in the ruins of his career and his pride. Crystal Admiral, the story of what happened at the Oasis Club that night did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through Naval Base Coronado with the speed of a shock wave, traveling through whispered conversations in mess halls, encrypted messages between ships at sea, and late-night calls in barracks rooms. It became an instant legend, a piece of modern military folklore. They called it the Night of Olympus, or simply Harrison's Law. The details were embellished with each telling. The number of hostiles, the level of danger, the ferocity of Admiral Martinez's takedown of the cocky seal. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. It was a story about assumptions. It was a story about the vast silent difference between perceived strength and actual power. It became a cautionary tale told to new recruits. A lesson in humility hammered home to cocky junior officers. The name Catherine Harrison, already respected in the high echelons of command, became something more among the enlisted ranks, a symbol. She was the quiet professional, the living embodiment of the idea that competence was its own credential, that authority was earned through action, not announced with bravado. The table where she had been sitting, a simple booth overlooking the bay, became an unofficial landmark. It was dubbed the Admiral's Perch. No one ever reserved it. He was to report in his dress uniform to Rear Admiral Martinez's office. He walked the long, sterile corridors of the headquarters, building feeling like a man on his way to his own execution. He was ushered into the office where Martinez sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. But Martinez was not alone. Standing by the window, looking out at the fleet anchored in the harbor, was Admiral Catherine Harrison. She was in her own service dress whites now, the 4 silver stars on her shoulder boards seeming to shine with an impossible brightness. She turned as he entered, and her eyes held the same calm, analytical gaze as they had in the club. There was no anger in them, no hint of triumph. There was only a quiet, professional assessment. Viper stood at rigid attention, his heart pounding in his chest. It was Admiral Harrison who spoke first. At ease, petty officer. Her voice was soft, but it carried the effortless authority of a rank. Admiral Martinez and I have discussed your actions, she said, her tone matter of fact. Your record up until that night has been exemplary. You are a highly skilled operator, an asset to your team, and to the Navy. She paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. You also demonstrated a profound lack of judgment. You allowed arrogance and prejudice to cloud your perception. In a combat situation, that kind of error can cost lives. Your own. And those are the men who trust you to make the right call. She walked slowly towards him, stopping a few feet away. The Navy has 2 options here. We can punish you, make an example of you, and in doing so, we would likely lose a valuable asset that has cost millions of dollars and years to train. Or we can ensure that the lesson has been learned, truly learned, and that you can then pass that lesson on to others. She looked him directly in the eye. I have recommended to Admiral Martinez that no formal disciplinary action be taken against you. Your record will remain clean. Viper was stunned in his silence. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was a reprieve he did not deserve, an act of grace that was more humbling than any punishment could ever be. Ma'am, I don't understand, he stammered. You understand perfectly. Petty officer, she replied, her expression unchanging. Punishment is easy. Education is hard. Your public humiliation was a far more effective lesson than any reduction in rank. You will carry that with you for the rest of your career. Every time you're about to make a snap judgment, every time you feel the urge to assert your dominance through arrogance, you will remember that night. You will remember what it felt like to be so profoundly and completely wrong. That memory will make you a better SEAL. It will make you a better leader. Do not waste it. She then gave him a single final piece of advice. Words that would become the new cornerstone of his professional ethos. Competence doesn't need a billboard, petty officer. Just be ready. With a slight nod, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving him alone with Admiral Martinez and the echoing silence of a second chance. Months later, the heat of the Persian Gulf shimmered off the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan. Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan stood on the fan, watching a new group of sailors go through a damage control drill. He was different now. The loud, boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity, a watchfulness that had not been there before. He was more observant, more thoughtful. He spoke less and listened more. His teammates had noticed a change. They called him to the monk, now a joke that held a core of truth. He had become a student of silence, a believer in the power of quiet competence. A young SEAL fresh from Bud/S and bristling with the same cocksure arrogance Viper himself had once possessed sidled up next to him. The kid gestured with his chin toward a new intelligence officer who was briefing a group of pilots nearby. She was young, barely out of college, and she spoke with a quiet academic precision. "Look at that," the young SEAL sneered. "They're sending us librarians now, but she's never even seen the inside of a gym." Viper didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "It's about a table at a club in Coronado. It's about a woman in a silk blouse, and it's about the biggest mistake I ever made in my life." He proceeded to tell the young SEAL the story of the night of Olympus, not as a piece of fleet gossip, but as a personal confession, a parable of his own foolishness. He explained the profound lesson Admiral Harrison had taught him without ever raising her voice. That the most dangerous person in any room is often the one you overlook. That true authority is not projected. It is recognized. The young SEAL listened, his smirk slowly fading, replaced by a look of dawning comprehension and respect. The lesson was being passed on. The legacy was continuing. That was the true genius of Admiral Harrison's leadership. She hadn't just corrected a single sailor's mistake. She had planted a seed of wisdom that was now growing in the harsh, unforgiving soil of special operations culture. The story was now officially part of the curriculum at the Naval Academy. She taught the United States Navy a lesson it desperately needed to learn, that its greatest strength lay not only in its ships and its weapons, but in the character of its people. And that character is best measured not in times of celebrated victory, but in quiet moments of personal integrity. The true strength of a warrior is not the ability to fight, but the wisdom to know when and how to lead. It is the understanding that true power needs no announcement, for it is felt in the calm of a crisis. It is heard in the clarity of command, and it is seen in the eyes of those who witness it. Is the quiet professional who ultimately shapes the world, not with noise, but with effect. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines true worth, subscribe. The aftermath of that night at the Oasis Club rippled through the Navy like a seismic shift. Within 48 hours, every major command from Norfolk to Pearl Harbor had received a detailed after-action report. The incident was classified as a critical learning event, dissected in staff meetings and war colleges across the fleet. Admiral Catherine Harrison found herself at the center of discussions she never sought, her actions becoming a case study in crisis leadership and the dangerous assumptions that could undermine military effectiveness. 3 weeks after the incident, Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan received orders that surprised everyone in his unit. Instead of the disciplinary transfer his teammates expected, he was assigned to the Admiral's staff as a special liaison for enlisted perspectives on officer training protocols. The assignment came with a security clearance upgrade and a mandate that made his new role clear. He would help design programs to prevent the kind of catastrophic judgment failure that had nearly destroyed his career. Admiral Harrison had specifically requested him, not as punishment, but as an instrument of change. She understood that the most powerful teacher of humility was someone who had learned it through profound personal failure. Sullivan would become a bridge between the enlisted ranks and the officer corps, helping to identify and eliminate the cultural blind spots that allowed arrogance to masquerade as leadership. His first assignment was to review the training curricula at the Naval Special Warfare Center. Sullivan found himself sitting in conference rooms with commanders and captains, sharing perspectives that would have been unthinkable just months before. He spoke about the dangerous mythology that surrounded elite units, the way success could breed a toxic sense of superiority that made operators vulnerable to exactly the kind of mistake he had made. The discussions were uncomfortable, sometimes heated. Senior officers who had built their careers on projecting strength struggled with concepts like intellectual humility and the recognition of competence regardless of its packaging. But Admiral Harrison had given Sullivan something more valuable than rank. She had given him credibility born of authentic transformation. Lieutenant James Chun underwent his own evolution in the weeks following the crisis. His performance under pressure, once Admiral Harrison took command, had been exemplary. But the memory of his initial panic haunted him. He requested additional training in crisis management and continuity of operations, spending his off-duty hours studying the protocols that had seemed like abstract theory until they became life-or-death reality. Chun discovered that Admiral Harrison had been quietly watching the development of junior officers across the Pacific Fleet. Her influence extended far beyond her official command structure. She maintained an informal network of mentorship that reached into every major installation from San Diego to Yokosuka. Young officers would find themselves selected for challenging assignments that seemed designed to test their judgment under pressure. They called it Harrison's finishing school, though she never acknowledged its existence. The lesson Shin learned was that competence under stress was not an innate trait, but a developed skill. Admiral Harrison had spent decades preparing for moments like the one at the Oasis Club. Her calm was not natural talent, but the product of relentless training and self-discipline. She had made herself into the leader the Navy needed precisely because she understood that leadership was not about commanding respect, but about earning it through consistent, measurable performance. Rear Admiral Robert Martinez found his own command philosophy evolving in response to the incident. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, maintaining discipline through clear hierarchies and unwavering standards. But Admiral Harrison's intervention forced him to examine whether his methods were producing genuine leadership or simply compliance masked as competence. Martinez began implementing what he called stress inoculation exercises. He would place his officers in simulated crisis situations where traditional command structures were disrupted or unclear. The goal was to identify those who could maintain effectiveness when the familiar frameworks of authority were stripped away. He discovered that many of his most promising officers crumbled when they could not rely on rank to ensure obedience. The exercises revealed something troubling about military culture. Too many officers had learned to project authority without developing the underlying competence that should justify it. They were leaders in name only, effective only as long as the system supported their position. When faced with genuine crisis, they became obstacles rather than assets. Admiral Harrison's approach was different. She cultivated what Martinez came to think of as invisible leadership. She influenced outcomes through expertise and judgment rather than formal command authority. Her officers followed her not because they had to, but because they recognized that following her led to success. It was a more difficult path to leadership, but it produced more reliable results. The investigation into the security breach that had triggered the lockdown revealed layers of institutional failure that extended far beyond the immediate incident. The threat had been real, though not in the way anyone initially understood. Foreign intelligence operatives had indeed targeted the Naval Communication Station, but their primary goal had been to test response protocols and identify vulnerabilities in the command structure. Admiral Harrison's intervention had not only neutralized the immediate crisis, but had also prevented the intelligence gathering that was the true objective of the operation. Her ability to see through the misdirection had saved more than just the people in the club. She had protected classified operational procedures that, if compromised, could have endangered naval operations across the Pacific. The full scope of her contribution was classified at levels so high that most of the people in the club that night never learned what they had really witnessed. They knew only that Admiral Harrison had transformed chaos into order with what seemed like effortless competence. The deeper truth was that her actions had implications for national security that reached far beyond a single evening in San Diego. Sullivan learned portions of this classified information during his new assignment. The knowledge was both humbling and terrifying. He came to understand that his arrogant behavior had not just been personally embarrassing. It had taken place in the presence of someone whose expertise was critical to defending the nation. His assumptions and prejudices had led him to dismiss exactly the kind of quiet competence that kept America safe. The realization changed his understanding of military service entirely. He began to see the armed forces not as a hierarchy of warriors, but as a network of specialized professionals whose effectiveness depended on mutual respect and recognition of diverse forms of excellence. The loudest person in the room was rarely the most valuable. The most essential contributors were often those who worked without fanfare or recognition. 6 months after the incident, Admiral Harrison was promoted to head the newly created Office of Integrated Naval Operations. Her mandate was to break down the cultural and procedural barriers that prevented effective cooperation between different specialties within the Navy. It was a role that had been created specifically for her. Recognition that the skills she had demonstrated that night at the Oasis Club were exactly what the modern military needed. Her first initiative was the implementation of cross-functional crisis response teams. Instead of relying on rigid command hierarchies, these teams would be built around expertise and competence regardless of rank or specialty. A junior enlisted technician with critical knowledge would have the authority to direct senior officers if the situation demanded it. The concept was revolutionary for a service built on tradition and rank structure. The resistance was immediate and intense. Senior officers who had spent careers climbing the traditional hierarchy saw the new approach as a direct threat to everything they understood about military leadership. They argued that discipline and order would collapse if rank became secondary to expertise. But Admiral Harrison had something they could not argue with: results. The pilot programs for integrated response teams consistently outperformed traditional units in crisis simulations. When faced with complex, multifaceted challenges, the teams that prioritized competence over hierarchy found solutions faster and implemented them more effectively. The data was overwhelming. Harrison's approach was not just more egalitarian, it was more effective. Sullivan found himself at the center of this transformation. His personal experience with the dangers of assumption-based leadership made him uniquely qualified to help design training programs that would prevent similar failures. He worked with Admiral Harrison to develop scenarios that would force officers and enlisted personnel to work together based on capability rather than rank. The programs were demanding and sometimes painful. Officers accustomed to automatic deference had to learn to recognize expertise wherever it appeared. Enlisted personnel had to develop the confidence to speak up when their knowledge was critical, even if it meant challenging senior ranks. The cultural shift was gradual but undeniable. Lieutenant Chun became one of the program's most effective advocates. His experience of being rescued from panic by Admiral Harrison's competence had taught him the value of expertise over ego. He developed a reputation as an officer who listened more than he spoke, who sought out the knowledge of specialists before making decisions that affected their areas of responsibility. Chin's approach attracted attention from across the fleet. Young officers began requesting assignments under his command, drawn by stories of a leadership style that valued substance over show. His units consistently performed at the highest levels, not because he demanded blind obedience, but because he had created an environment where excellence was recognized and rewarded regardless of its source. The transformation was not without its casualties. Several senior officers who could not adapt to the new emphasis on competence over rank found their careers stalling. Some requested transfers to commands that maintained more traditional approaches. Others simply retired rather than face the challenge of proving their worth through performance rather than position. But for every officer who struggled with the changes, 2 more embraced them. The Navy began attracting a different caliber of leader, people who were drawn to service not by the appeal of authority, but by the opportunity to excel in complex, demanding environments. The emphasis on competence created a culture where the best ideas won regardless of where they originated. Admiral Harrison watched these changes with quiet satisfaction. She had not set out to revolutionize Navy culture that night at the Oasis Club. She had simply responded to a crisis with the tools and training she had spent decades developing. But the ripple effects of that response were transforming an institution in ways that would strengthen it for generations to come. The story of that night became more than military folklore. It became a teaching tool used in leadership courses across all branches of service. The incident was studied not just for its tactical lessons, but for its insights into the psychology of leadership and the dangers of cultural assumptions that could blind even experienced professionals to the competence that surrounded them. Years later, when military historians wrote about the transformation of 21st-century naval leadership, they would trace many of the changes back to a single evening at a club overlooking San Diego Bay. They would write about Admiral Katherine Harrison's intervention as a pivotal moment when the Navy began to recognize that its greatest strength lay not in maintaining traditional hierarchies, but in harnessing all available expertise regardless of how it was packaged. But the people who were there that night understood something the historians would miss. The real lesson was not about military tactics or organizational theory. It was about the fundamental human capacity for growth and the power of authentic humility to transform not just individuals, but entire institutions. Admiral Harrison had not just prevented a crisis. She had planted seeds of wisdom that would continue growing long after she had moved on to new challenges. Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan, now Senior Chief Sullivan, still tells the story to young sailors who remind him of his former self. He tells them about the night he learned that true strength announces itself not through volume, but through competence, not through dominance, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your craft and respecting the expertise of others. The lesson continues to spread, carried forward by every service member who learns that leadership is not about commanding respect, but about earning it through consistent excellence and genuine humility. In a world where loud voices often drown out quiet competence, the story of Admiral Harrison stands as a reminder that the most important battles are often won by those who never need to announce their presence because their actions speak with undeniable authority.